Joe, that every dollar I'd ever saved up until that point in time in my life went into the business. And so I needed, I had a depleted savings account. So, I literally didn't have a dollar to my name. And
And I
every
started
dollar
in
I
HR.
Mimic the hormone that
Northwestern Memorial Hospital here in Chicago.
literally had the chance to speak with physicians from every state in this country.
You save $32 million in an hour.
Hey, I'm Joe. Welcome to the 5 Mile Difference podcast. The name comes from something that's quite close to me, where I grew up in Philadelphia, 2 zip codes just 5 miles apart. The average life expectancy difference is 20 years. We're here to talk about why that's the case and what you and I could do to change it. Hi, Tim. Welcome to Vitable's 5 Mile Difference podcast. Really excited to have you on today.
Yeah, Joe, thanks for having me. I appreciate the time.
Amazing. Well, I think part of my excitement for having our conversation today is there's very few healthcare entrepreneurs that have gone through the journey that you have to also just have the level of outcome that you had. And I think it's quite rare for those entrepreneurs that have had those outcomes to freely share their knowledge with the next generation of builders. And you in our conversations, you've been quite kind to share them with me. And so I'm excited to share them with the audience as well. But maybe to start, would love if you could give a quick background on how you came to start VillageMD, and especially just, I know you went to Cornell for your undergrad and you started a company right before, but would love to give if you could give a quick overview of how you came to start VillageMD.
Sure. Well, and one of the things, Joe, that I think you've heard, and I'm sure many others have heard, is that your career only ever makes sense when you look in the rearview mirror. And I think that for me, that was definitely the case. I did go to Cornell. Proud to be a trustee of Cornell today and give back to the university that frankly gave me so much. After that, I worked a couple different jobs. I went to graduate school, thought I was going to be a professor, and came to the realization that I wanted to develop some skill sets and some work experience that was relevant before I'd ever think about being in academia again. I worked in consulting for a while, and I think it was some great learning to have the chance to learn what it's like to deal with a client, to deal with a series of operational issues, to learn how to, work within the construct of a team, to really think about what value is for the client, and then to be, pretty focused on delivering that value. From there, I had my first experience joining an early stage company. And I tell you that experience is one of the best ones I had because I was still pretty young in my career. I want to say I was maybe 5 or 6 years out of my undergrad. And I was kind of thrust into an opportunity to try to integrate 2 companies that this company I was working for, they acquired these 2 companies. And part of my job was to kind of help run, in one case, turn around, and also integrate these companies into the larger enterprise. And just to have that kind of experience where you're thinking about the strategy, you're thinking about the day in, day out performance of the business. You're thinking about where do you have fires that are going on and how do you go out and put those out? Even though I really hadn't been exposed to that industry, it was in the telecom industry. It was a fascinating learning experience, and one of the things that I encourage, frankly, anyone who's sort of early stage in their career is go have the chance to learn what it's like to hire and fire people, learn to have the experience to go out and sell and hear someone say no, learn to put a plan in place and see it not come to fruition and then have to course correct on your plan and know that you have to live with the result. And I was very lucky, frankly, to have that experience, and that encouraged me to then want to go out and become an entrepreneur. And I started my first company, and as you alluded to, that first company was a failure, and it was an incredible success from the standpoint of the knowledge and skills that I learned. But from the standpoint of how do you perform as a business and do you create something that is financially sustainable, it was by far a failure. But then I had to learn how to go out and raise capital. I had to learn how to work with lawyers and draft agreements and negotiate agreements. I had to work with financial teams on preparing financials and thinking through cash flow and how we're going to manage cash flow. And so there's just so many things that happened along the way that I'm grateful that I had those experiences. Ultimately, what led me to VillageMD was that I was working in healthcare. The Medicare Modernization Act, which was signed into law of December of 2003, brought in the idea of acuity adjustment for Medicare Advantage plans. And I had this sort of Jerry Maguire moment, for those that have seen the movie, where I came to the realization that if a payer, in this case CMS, was going to pay the insurance company based upon the actual sickness or risk of each insured beneficiary, then it will change the way that ultimately healthcare is delivered, because insurance companies will have to realize that they don't do very well controlling costs outside of prior auth and utilization management. And if we ever want to get a different set of quality outcomes at a lower total cost, it's going to require insurance companies to work with providers. And so I had this aha moment that was, well, gosh, like all the opportunity in this world of improving value in our healthcare system is going to be tied to how do we ultimately have physicians that can step off of the fee-for-service treadmill and be working in an environment where they get paid based upon the outcomes they generate for their patients, which is ultimately, when we think about it, what patients most want from us. Is they want as healthcare providers, they want to know that the care that we're providing to them is not just the best they can provide in a 15-minute increment, but it's the best care that they can receive throughout the course of their life, right? And so that was the ultimate inspiration that led myself and Paul Martino and Clive Fields to start VillageMD.
That's quite an amazing journey, going from telecom to healthcare. And it seems like the Medicare Modernization Act was quite it was an important inflection point in your life, and ultimately led to you starting VillageMD. But going back a bit to
Yeah.
um, uh, you know, growing up, what did you aspire to be? Did you always want to be an entrepreneur? I think there's often this general idea that entrepreneurs are born, not made. And so if you didn't wake up dreaming of starting a business, and maybe it's not for you. But curious, like, what was your experience like, and what was it like as you grew up?
Yeah, it's so funny you asked that question, Joe, because I grew up in this small town in northeast Wisconsin, and I'm not sure I could have spelled the word entrepreneur growing up. I think I saw lots of different. It was a small town, right, and somewhat rural, and so you saw all different types of businesses, and I didn't necessarily have an appreciation for who was an entrepreneur, who worked for a company. I was pretty oblivious to that. My father worked for a shipbuilding company, and his career advice to me when I was graduating from college was to go work for a big company, because they're going to have good benefits, and which is the last thing that goes through an entrepreneur's mind when they're actually thinking about starting a company. And so the short answer is that I feel very fortunate to have ended up as an entrepreneur. And I will tell you quite, blatantly that I think entrepreneurs are what make the world go round. And my wish for everyone who goes out into the workplace is to become an entrepreneur, because the feeling of control that you have, the excitement, the exuberance of creating something new and different, even if you're an entrepreneur in a very traditional industry, you can go and create a whole new kind of experience for your customers. You can create a new experience for your employees. Like, you live in this world where you can go and just create. And so for me, I feel very fortunate to have ended up there. I clearly didn't start there, and my path very early on working inside of big companies was not such that would have led me to believe that I could be an entrepreneur. But I am fortunate, right, that I had that one experience, as I referenced earlier, in the telecom world, that it gave me a little bit of a taste of what it would be like to kind of start your own thing, run your own thing, have more control of your destiny. And once you do that, to me, I think you get hooked, right? I'm sure you probably feel the exact same way as a successful entrepreneur, that, having the ability to sort of set direction, to be a part of a team, that's creating something new, that there's not an exact playbook for what you're looking to do. That to me is what makes things make.
And so, if I'm remembering correctly, you grew up in a town of about 8,000 people, and
That's right.
in your talk at Cornell, you mentioned that you felt that was you were a city boy because everyone else lived in a town of 200 people. I guess like I'm just trying to think back like about the wild success that you've had in any industry, and in healthcare where you get to have your success gets to a byproduct of that is having positive lasting impact in the communities that you served, and
Yeah.
also helping change and prove that a new model of primary care can exist and thrive. I mean, the going from growing up in a town of 8,000 people to the incredible success that you've had, and coming out of school, it seems like it wasn't healthcare was not you weren't navigating, or you weren't necessarily leaning into healthcare from the very beginning. And so, what was that moment from? And your first company also wasn't in healthcare. And
Correct.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, and in fact, I believe you worked at Philip Morris.
Yeah, I did.
How did you go from Philip Morris to and make your way to healthcare? And in retrospect, were you always looking for impact, or what ultimately drove you to healthcare?
Yeah. Well, the shortest answer to that question is that I have my wife to thank for being in the healthcare industry. My wife and one of my college roommates. The longer answer is that I followed my dad's advice. I worked for a large company that had benefits. It was Philip Morris USA. I was in the marketing and sales training program. It was a management training program, which back then it was sort of a somewhat sought after to find a management training program. I was in the job for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks and thought, what the hell am I doing? Like, I don't wake up every day hoping that people can, buy more cigarettes. It was not sort of who I was. Yes, it paid me a job and it paid the bills. And as a kid from Wisconsin that didn't have two nickels to rub together, I needed a job. And so eventually, I think unlike a lot of, and this is something that I think is actually interesting about maybe my generation versus some younger generations, is that the level of awareness that like even like my son, the level of awareness he has about different industries and careers is about 1,000 times greater than what I had. And when I talk to my friends and my peers, when we were 18, 19 years old and someone said, what are you going to do after college? The answer was get a job. We weren't 16, 17 years old and already building companies or thinking about how we were going to spend our life when we were 22 years old. And we sure as heck when we were in college weren't thinking, okay, oh, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur. It was it was truly a function of I want to graduate and then I want to get a job. And as I'm out in the workplace, I'll kind of figure it out, which I'm sure to some listeners is probably that they're thinking, oh, that sounds horrible. Like, how, if you don't have a plan, like, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And at the same time, I look at, when I talk to young aspiring entrepreneurs, I sometimes feel bad that they feel like if they're not on the right track today, that they're like they're going to live this life of misery. I actually do subscribe to kind of the journey is the reward. And for me, it was, having that experience of working in a job, wondering like, what the hell am I doing? To then move to some other jobs that I knew they were giving me skill sets, but they never inspired me to want to keep doing what I was doing. And that was in consulting or the telecom industry. And frankly, it was only, I started, the first company I started was a education startup. And there's a Benjamin Franklin quote that knowledge is not knowledge until shared. And so I created this company. It was called Evo Knowledge. The idea is the evolution of knowledge, right? So that we can actually do what I think you're trying to do here, is to figure out if I know a thing or two and be able to share it with others. And that was the basis behind that company, was to figure out how do you tap into the learnings of others so you can accelerate the development and pathway for so many others. And that's the company that was an objective failure, but it's ultimately what led me to then, be introduced to healthcare. First, my wife said to me one night, she was doing work for Blue Cross of California, which is part of then WellPoint, now elements. And she said, I think you really like healthcare. You care about communities. You have a social orientation to you, and you're kind of a math nerd. Like, I think you would like all the numbers, and you'd like working with, this industry and the impact that they're trying to have. And so she's the one that kind of started to open my mind toward it. And then I had a college roommate who had started his own consulting business, and he brought me in to be a consultant for Blue Shield of California, the nonprofit Blue in the state of California. And truth be told, I didn't know the difference between a PCP and a PPO. But I was a curious person, and I knew what it was like to be a consultant because I had done that for PricewaterhouseCoopers earlier in my career. So I knew what it was like to work in and instantly, create credibility and work with clients and build relationships. I also knew what it was like to be an operator because of the work I did at the telecom company. And I knew that, at the end of the day, performance matters, right? And I was able to find where are the biggest issues. And then I also own my own business. And as an entrepreneur, right? Everyone here that's an entrepreneur knows that every single problem that exists in your company, right? So if you're a single person just starting off, or you've got 1,000 employees or 10,000 employees, every problem that's going on in your business. You have to prioritize them, but what's going on. And so for me, I had the benefit of stepping into this time at Blue Shield where ultimately I was asking every question I could, trying to learn from the general counsel, to learn from the head of network management, to the head of claims and member enrollment and medical management. And you name it, you're trying to piece together what's going on in the business to ultimately help and bring value. And it was there that I had the opportunity to, spend some time with the CEO of Blue Shield of California, Bruce Bedakin, who was kind enough to offer me a job. And he offered me a leadership role in the organization. And it was there that I began to realize, hey, once I started to understand the business, that there's this huge opportunity out there to really find a way for physicians to deliver better value to patients, because that was something that I felt was just missing in every conversation I had. If I was talking to folks inside the insurance company, it was all about, are we more efficient at how we pay claims and answer phone calls, and are we getting the best discounts from providers? And when you talk to providers, it was always, how do I get more money per claim from the insurance company? The conversation was never about how are we all coming together to deliver unbelievable outcomes and doing it in the most resource efficient way. Because as we all know, everyone's trying to get their fair share of the healthcare dollar, and ultimately the patients who suffers.
Right. And so that's quite an incredible journey. So you had this conversation with your wife that mentioned, you might actually like healthcare. And then you join your friend's consulting company, eventually meeting the CEO of um, uh, Blue Cross Blue Shield of California.
Yeah, Blue Shield of California. Yeah.
Blue Shield of California. And you were offered the leadership role. How old were you at that time when you were offered the leadership role?
32.
So that's quite young. At that point, you have had the telecom experience, merging the two entities.
Yeah.
Also started your own company and run it for a few years. I guess maybe going back to the first company that you started, can you walk me through what was you mentioned the Ben Franklin quote. What was it like to start, like the very beginning? And then, how long did you work on it, and what were the key moments or end takeaways for you from the Evo Knowledge experience?
Yeah. So, well, I can tell you the experience on the very first day. I was living in Chicago. My wife and I, we were then engaged. We had an apartment, and I remember we used her old laptop. That was the first asset that the company had, and I sat down on a chair, and I remember plugging the laptop into the wall to get internet, and sitting there thinking, okay, I got to build a business plan, right? Like I knew I had a rough outline of what I thought could be achievable, and partly work I had done while I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers in consulting was around knowledge management. And so, I knew that there fundamentally was a problem that across large disparate organizations, that employees didn't always have access to the top minds or the people with the most amount of knowledge. And the way that you disseminated knowledge was kind of through all these informal channels. And so the idea behind the business was ultimately to sort of work with largely corporate training departments and to go to them and figure out what are the areas that are most significant for them to get in terms of training and development. And then how do you, instead of buying what I thought was garbage off the shelf that was, here's sales 101 training. My sales pitch going into the people that ran learning and development was to say, you can either buy sales 101 training that you provide to your, 10,000 sales force, or we can go out and you can tell me who the 50 best salespeople are in your company, and we can create customized modules that really tap into the core learnings for what make them effective. And so imagine taking your top 50 performers out of 10,000 sales reps and improving the bottom, third, right?
Right.
And you wouldn't have to improve them very much to get a huge ROI, right? So that was the fundamental basis for the company. But we needed to have some products. We needed to have a technology platform that ultimately was the vehicle with which to deliver this. And this is sort of 1998, because like today it seems so obvious to everyone, but back then it wasn't, right? There was not, most of the video-based training that was done, you would put into a VHS cassette, and you'd fly people in to sit in a room, put a TV in front of the room, you'd put in the VHS cassette, and you'd hit play. And so that wasn't an effective way of providing training. And so our thought was, we're going to leverage the internet, we're going to leverage technology that's decreasing in cost, and we're going to make it easier to disseminate all this knowledge to people. We very early on, we knew, I self-funded the business for the first couple years the business was around. We went out, we ultimately raised a little bit of capital from some family and friends, but it was a bootstrapped company. And it was a bootstrap company because, we started this company in the late and for those who may be familiar, there's a thing called the internet bubble that burst, and ultimately, raising capital at that point in time for something that looked like an internet startup just didn't, frankly, happen. Get customers, we knew we'd have to do it, pretty cost efficiently. As a company, we went out and we actually secured a lot of different customers. Unfortunately, what we learned very early on was that when you'd work for a company like Tribune, or you worked for a PricewaterhouseCoopers or a Grant Thornton, these were all customers of ours. You'd sign them on as a customer. You'd think that you'd be selling in a license for like 20,000 employees to use the solution. Unfortunately, we ran into the hurdle of the technology departments in these large corporations in the late 90s were not comfortable with that amount of video being streamed across their network, right? And so as a result, we ended up with a lot of different customers who would spend $8,000 or $9,000 buying a license for 60 or 70 people instead of 5,000. So for us, our challenge ultimately became one where there was a restriction that we knew over time that companies would open up the bandwidth, but there was a challenge in terms of being able to kind of wait it out and create enough content and have enough customers to have a real business. And so It's interesting because if I rattled off all the list of customers we had, it was a blue chip list of customers. Unfortunately, at that point in time, there wasn't a ton of investment going on into training and development. There was also not a ton of investment going into the infrastructure that it would allow for video-based training to be disseminated widespread. And we just ran into a buzzsaw that way. And so 3.5 years into it, I had to face the very difficult journey or difficult decision of knowing that I had every dollar I'd ever saved in my life I put into the company. It didn't look like we were going to have the sort of breakthrough that we ultimately thought we might be able to have, and so we ultimately had to shut it down.
That's quite the journey. So it was about three and a half years.
No worries.
It sounds like you ran Evo Knowledge for about 3.5 years, self-funded it, except for a bit of friends and family, a small friends and family round. And you had the blue chip customers, but given you started in 1998, and so you were building within the dot-com bubble, and
Right.
the in terms of revenue, what was the peak, if you can remember?
It was
Yeah.
I mean, it was de minimis, right? It was sort of like the point I was making earlier was that, we'd sign up a blue chip customer, but we'd get $8,000 for the total revenue from that customer, right? So, we would have at any given point in time, we might have 10, 15 plus different customers, but at $8,000 to $10,000 per pop, it doesn't really give you a business
Wow.
to build off of.
That must have been quite a challenging time. If I'm remembering correctly, right as you were shutting it down, you were expecting
That's right.
expecting and building the family.
Yeah, exactly.
Was that the lowest point of your life until then? Or like, I'm trying to build empathy on what was it like to be Tim as you were shutting down that 3.5 year journey?
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, I obviously was thrilled. I was going to have a child, and so we, thrilled about having the family, and so many parts of my life were absolutely off the charts. But it was tough. Yeah, it was. There's no question. It was the first time that I had, in my life, put that much committed effort into something, only to end up with zero, right? And so there's no doubt it was. You go through a lot of soul searching. You wonder. You spend time thinking, well, maybe because I was not an entrepreneur when I was young, maybe I didn't have what it takes. Maybe what could I have done differently? Why did I fail? And it's I think natural to kind of go through this sort of period of time where you're grieving, if you will, the loss of this business that you thought had potential. I think every entrepreneur has sort of been in that journey where when you're building something, you're wondering, is this going to make it or not, right? And a lot of times you sort of you get the advice of hold on, right? Just hold on and you'll get there. And frankly, I believed in that for a long period of time, even when the outlook for Evo Knowledge wasn't that rosy. There's times where I thought, I know for a fact that video distributed across the internet will be a big thing. And I talked to enough of the brightest minds that were out there to be convinced of that. And so it's just a matter of, are we building the right product? Can we hold on? I think I may have shared this with you, Joe, that we did at one point in time, we had a capital source that wanted to invest in the business, and that would have bought a lot more time for us. But that investor also wanted a huge majority of the business. And as an entrepreneur, you sit there and you have to make these difficult decisions and it's trade-offs on, okay, well, should I take the capital? And if I do take the capital, then is I still going to be around or am I not going to be around? And at that point in time, if they have control of the business, are they going to send us down a path that you really want as the ultimate, builder of the business, right? And so there's just a lot of things that you end up, I know every entrepreneur on this call has to think through on a daily basis that most people never even are aware that you have to be making those kinds of decisions or trade-offs, but they are very real. And And there's a lot of times I wondered, should we have taken that capital, and would that have been the best thing for the business or not? And I'm sure there's lots of entrepreneurs that would sit there and say you should have taken the capital, and others would say you made the right decision. But ultimately, those are the kinds of trade-offs that we have to make. And I am a believer ultimately that in any entrepreneurial success, that there's always a lot of work. We all know that, but there's also always a little bit or a lot of luck that sort of comes your way that allows you to sort of get to the next plateau in your business or the next stage of your business that not everybody gets the chance to experience.
It's fascinating because I'm imagining, and how old were you at the time as you were expecting your first child and you're shutting down Evo Knowledge?
Well, yeah. So I got into healthcare right shortly thereafter, right? So I was 31, 32 years old when I was shutting it down and talking to Blue Shield.
You're 31 and you've just had this experience that seems quite harrowing, and
Yeah.
you're grieving your baby, your metaphorical baby, as you
Yeah, exactly.
your real baby into the world. And I think the for like one of the things that you said that actually quite resonated with me is it seems building is this balance between persistence and also being objective around how things actually are. And it's a fine balance to strike because you can being honest and truthful about, well, is this path actually, is there a light at the end of this particular tunnel, or
Yeah.
something else. As you were, and one other funny item or thought is, it seems like you've built in the most difficult, or at least most difficult, like industries for entrepreneurs to build, one education and the other healthcare. So you left one for maybe a more difficult one. But
Yeah.
as you were transitioning to healthcare, at the time, did you say that entrepreneurship and starting companies just isn't for me? That's a chapter that I'm just going to leave in the background, or I just need a job, and this path seems to be fruitful. Or how were you thinking about that next step? Obviously, right, like a bit before starting VillageMD.
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier, Joe, that every dollar I'd ever saved up until that point in time in my life went into the business. And so I needed, I had a depleted savings account. So, I literally didn't have a dollar to my name. And so the conversation that Stephanie and I had was, it makes sense for me to go work in an organization where I can leverage the learning and skill that I've developed and, get paid, and let's start putting some money away. And I think she knew that how much I love being an entrepreneur, and she encouraged me to still be involved in various entrepreneurial paths in different ways, and I was, but at the same time, like, I needed to put some food on the table. And so I chose the path of being an executive in a larger company to be in a spot where I could afford to save some money and help cover the bills.
And so as you were making that transition, maybe in that first year or so,
Yeah.
what was the biggest shift or learning, or maybe new paradigm that you saw that was vastly different from the career that you'd had up to that point?
Yeah, well, it's funny. One of the first meetings I was in, gosh, there must have been like 14 or 15 people around a table. And I thought to myself, wow, none of these people are paying the bill for this meeting to occur. And if they were, there wouldn't be 14 or 15 people around the table. And I thought, how could any decision ever get made? Like, it kind of blew my mind, right? That, like, as an entrepreneur, you want to, there's so many things to be involved in. There's so many decisions to make that, spending an hour on a meeting that should take 10 or 15 minutes, or even just having that many people around the table, 70% of which don't even open their mouth during the meeting, you kind of wonder what's going on here. So I think for me, one of the biggest things was just sort of the notion about how do you, like, leveraging the efficiency of people and resources, right? And optimizing their time and the time of the organization and the business. That was one thing. The second was, as an entrepreneur, you get really clear around what drives value. is this thing that we are doing as a business, quantifiably, can I say this drives value to the business? And maybe that quantification is around customer satisfaction. Maybe this quantification is around quality of life for employees. But to me, there was always management is the allocation of scarce resources, right? Like we all know that that's the definition. And yet we don't always think about resources being scarce. And as an entrepreneur, you're acutely aware every single day, especially in the environment that I came from where I was using my own capital, that like every dollar or cent that you're spending is very real. And so from that standpoint, I saw a level of inefficiency that I found, challenging at sometimes, right? Now, with that said, and I've shared this with people a lot, that had I not had that suite of experiences that led me to that point, I would not have been able to be effective as you've indicated, a fairly young leader in a large, multi-billion-dollar organization. And it's only because I had to have that level of accountability and ownership and responsibility as an entrepreneur, and the ability to think across the entirety of the spectrum of the organization. Because I think even in a large organization, the people who are ultimately most successful are not those that wear just one hat. Even if they're working in HR, they'll understand, or hopefully they'll understand, finance and the financials of the business. They'll understand, how do we actually make money in the business? How do we, care for people? How do we provide this service, right? How is technology used in the business? And so I think being an entrepreneur, you're forced to learn every part of your business so that for me, when I then went into that other business, I had a chance to move down the learning curve a lot faster and ask a lot of questions and get to a spot where I could figure out what value looked like because I had that experience as an entrepreneur.
That's quite fascinating. It seems like part of the takeaway, at least the lesson learned that I guess maybe when you went to the larger organization, you still acted with an extreme level of accountability, and you weren't quite narrow in your view of this is my role or this is a company. And it sounds like that's actually quite rare in the very large organization.
I've not been in enough large organizations in full disclosure to know, but I will say the people that I've always been impressed by that work inside large organizations that seem to have been very successful in those large organizations are the ones who think multidimensionally about the business, right? That they're not, even if they're hired to be the head of marketing, they're not just the marketing person, that they, they learn to work collaboratively with the rest of the leadership team, but they don't show up for a meeting, a capital planning meeting and ask for, $50 million at a point in time when the CFO is looking to cut, 72 million from the capital budget, right? They have the ability to really think systematically about the business. And I think that's something that I think the entrepreneurial training ground gives you that set of skills unlike any other place you can find.
It's interesting because I think at times when I speak with other entrepreneurs, they'll at times have they'll speak with maybe an aversion and maybe not as much respect for people that are able to drive impact at large organizations. But as I hear you speak, you seem to have quite high respect for those rare people that are able to drive impact. And maybe it leads me to ask, what was the biggest, in the lead up to you starting VillageMD and starting another company again, what are some of the things that you, outside of the industry context that you gathered, and just about building companies or operating companies, what are some of the things that you learned while operating at Blue Shield?
Yeah, so I mean, I was at Blue Shield. I then left and I went to a company called Universal American, and that's where I had the chance to. I was a chief operating officer of this $2.8 billion Medicare Advantage plan. I like for me, Joe, even inside of a large organization, the beauty of a large organization is that the cash register, if you will, it's largely going to ring tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next month and the next quarter and the next year without, a monumental change in what the leadership team does. Right? So for most businesses, they have this existing platform, and now it's just a matter of how do you as a leader improve upon that platform, hopefully in a step function way to drive more value for your business, but largely you don't have to worry about that to the same degree as you do when you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to figure out, am I going to make payroll next year, and what level of sales do we have to get this month to make sure that we're on the right path, right? So there's just a different level of places to engage in the business depending upon the size of the platform and the set of resources that you're ultimately playing with. But for me, the thing that I have always sort of held true to is that in all cases, whether you have a really big platform or you have a small platform, you have to make sure that you're thinking about growth. And even if that growth is 4 or 5%, or that growth is, 120 to 140%, you need to be thinking about growth. And do you have the right people and systems in place to be thinking about what that growth looks like? And so for me, I've always gravitated toward, whether it's in an entrepreneurial environment or in a more steady state environment, and that is to really test, where do we stand on our growth? What would growth look like? Even if we decide not to go out and get it, even if we make the decision that the only way we're going to grow is through acquisition, and we're not ready for an acquisition right now, to me, growth is sort of part of how I've thought about every business. And I think that that's something that when you do focus on that growth, it then really requires you to sort of understand all the levers around how good is our product. What's the nature of our relationship with our customers? Is it, and whether you're a B2B business or a B2C business, I think these still hold true. How is our product? What's our customer relationships like? What's the nature of our distribution channels, whether they be, leveraging the internet or whether it's a salesperson selling into a company. And so to me, there's an element that when you do that, you sort of think about what are all the parts that contribute to that growth, and how do I make sure that we're paying attention to those, and that we're understanding the trade-offs that we make as it relates to how we support that level of growth. And it then when you do all of that and you bring your team together, again, either as an entrepreneur where it's just you and 2 other people, or it's a team of 8 people that you're managing, you can have that dialogue around, this is how what growth looks like. These are the things that matter most in terms of how we grow. Where are we? How do we do? What can we improve? Are we all aligned around this, right? And so I gravitate there. Again, part of it's my initial bias as an entrepreneur. Part of it's also, I think, in the context of, when you're running a business, it's more fun to grow than it is to not grow, right? And so being able to sort of mobilize people around growth, to me, is always a fun thing, even if it's a staged approach to that growth. So that's one thing. The second is, okay, ultimately, whatever product or service that we have, do we really understand how we make money, right? So we understand how we grow. We understand what makes the cash register ring. Now, do we really understand how that translates into profit? And from there, do we have a like-minded view of what the things are that get in the way of us achieving a certain level of profitability? And, are we investing in areas to improve that? Or are we performing in the ways that we need to? And ultimately, that gives us the opportunity to then look at the people, right? To say, do we have opportunities to improve? Do we, and whether that be through some, development, or do we need to upgrade talent? And so to me, when you start with the growth, it sort of gets everybody focused on a mindset of we're going to be growing, just a matter of what it is. And then how are we making sure that as we grow, that we ultimately can translate that into to dollars, right? And dollars in a way that allows us to achieve a level of profitability. Because ultimately, in the growth side of the equation, you're thinking about the customer. You're thinking about what that value creates. And in order for you to deliver that, you ultimately have to have a level of profit to continue to do that, to also allow you to continue to grow, right? And so for me, I kind of a bit overly simplistic of looking at it from those two lenses, to then look at it and say, all right, well, from a people standpoint, from a culture standpoint, do folks understand what it is we're trying to accomplish as a business? And are we communicating with the people in the organization in a way that they feel attached to what we're trying to accomplish? They understand the path that we're going to take to get there, and that they also feel like we're supporting them and providing that investment in them to ensure that we can all achieve the goals that we're setting out. To me, again, whether it's large company, and frankly, that's something that at VillageMD, when we were 12 people, or when we were 21,000 people, that's the same sort of orientation that we had, right? There's a set of must-haves that we want to achieve as a business, and then can we break those down across those different areas to determine how will we best succeed in achieving those in support of our goals, for, in the case of Village, for our patients, for providers, for the system at large, for our employees, our shareholders, et cetera.
Amazing. And so maybe actually shifting a bit to the VillageMD experience, you
Yeah.
mentioned 21,000 employees, and I read at the over $7 billion of revenue. But maybe if you could give a snapshot of what is VillageMD and what is the at its peak, and maybe even today, what is the scale that you built it towards? And then we would love to understand that initial inception, and also how you got to meet your co-founders as well.
Yeah. So, well, VillageMD today is, and Joe, but maybe everyone doesn't. I'm no longer the CEO of the organization. I'm no longer chair of the board. It's a company that we sold a controlling interest to Walgreens 2.5 years ago, and all of the relevant stats on the company, people can go look at Walgreens' latest quarterly earnings and get information on that. But going back to the inception, I had worked with Dr. Clive Fields, who was a physician in the Houston market. And when I was at Universal American was a Medicare Advantage plan. It also owned an IPA. And Dr. Fields was his physician group was one of the best contributors of that IPA, and he alone, as a physician, was one of the best performers in these value-based contract models that we had at Universal American. And so I got to know Clive there and began to appreciate just how talented he is as a clinician, but as a physician leader, both in his practice, in the IPA, and then ultimately he and I started a healthcare business for Accretive Health. And in so doing, I had a chance to see him just in front of so many other physician leaders around the country, and the level of respect that he earned so quickly because of his knowledge, both as a clinician and as a leader, was quite remarkable. So, he and I had the benefit of literally standing side by side with physicians across the country, both at Universal American and at Accretive Health, that we realized that the challenges that exist for primary care doctors, the same challenges that exist in Houston are challenges that exist in Derry, New Hampshire, that exist in Phoenix, Arizona, that exist in Boise, Idaho, that at the end of the day, physicians ultimately want to deliver a better experience for their patients. They want to deliver higher value healthcare, and they generally lack the resources to be able to do so. No surprise that in our country, we have invested behind the pharmaceutical industry. We've invested behind hospitals. We've invested behind all different parts of the healthcare ecosystem, and rarely invested the way we needed to in primary care, as well as specialty physicians at large. And so from our lens, we always knew there was an opportunity to bring physicians together, both in existing markets as well as around the country, to create a new model of care delivery. In order to do that and do that effectively, we needed to make sure that we could change the way that we were paid for the care that we deliver. And along the way, through my journey, through Clive's journey, we met Paul Martino, who was a career executive at a number of different health plans. And at the time, prior to the launch of VillageMD, Paul was working for then Anthem, now Elevance. And so Paul was working on clinical innovation, and he was working on all different types of pilots around the country that were trying to where Anthem was trying to move the needle on improving outcomes for their members. And he ultimately came to the conclusion that the best type of innovation would be innovation that comes from the provider care delivery world. And so Paul and Clive and I met up, and we started to talk about what a business would look like. And we were all sort of true to the spirit of, we need to invest in primary care. We need to change the way that we get paid and be focused on outcomes and a value-based reimbursement model. We think the right solution is a solution that focuses on all patient populations, right? So like when we talk about diabetes in this country, the average age where someone's diagnosed with diabetes is age 50. So, if you're going to have a long-term impact on the healthcare system, you can't just wait till someone's 70 years old and they become your patient in a Medicare Advantage plan when they've been living with diabetes for 20 years, right? We have to be focused on all patient populations. We have to do it where we're thinking about engagement with patients on a high touch, proactive way, where ultimately the patients feel the care and support and love that we have for them, so that they in fact will want to be on this journey with us to a better model of health, because we all know that without patient involvement and patient engagement, you're never going to get to a different set of healthcare outcomes. And so there's a number of tenets that we all believed in quite quite vigorously, that this was the right way to approach it. And so we came together. We started in the Houston market. We started with Clive's practice, and frankly, we saw a lot of success. There's a lot of things we saw very early on with payers wanting to jump on board to a model that was focused on value. We saw very early on improvements in quality, reductions in the total cost of care. And so we knew we had something that was a model that could work. Prior work that we did at Universal American and Accretive Health led us to believe and know that this would scale. And we knew the challenges existed everywhere. And so then it was just a matter of going out to new markets and identifying other leading physicians and or physician groups that just fundamentally know there's a better model of care out there, and recruited them to be a part of it.
And I heard you say that one of the pieces of advice that you often give is that entrepreneurs should self-fund the business from, at least in the earlier years. And given your experience at the previous Evo Knowledge, I'm imagining maybe that at least I believe you've self-funded VillageMD at the beginning. And as you had the success in Houston and you were thinking about the next market to replicate the model in, I guess maybe trying to build empathy into what that first year or two looked like for you.
Yeah.
And your co-founders, what were the things that were concerning you most and keeping you up at night, if any? How did you then, like, what was it? And I'm also just like generally curious if you felt like VillageMD would become what it ultimately did become, or maybe what was the vision early on?
Yeah, I say with great humility, Joe, I always believed it would become what it did. And I say that because of a few things. One is that I literally had the chance to speak with physicians from every state in this country. And it's the same thing everywhere. It's the same thing where, you have these incredible people that commit their life to delivering care for patient populations, and they're unbelievably under-resourced. And there's so much that can happen to deliver a better outcome for patients, right? I mean, like, we've all seen the data on the few number of patients that incur the majority of the healthcare misery or spend. At the end of the day, we know who so many of these patients are, and so the questions, it's not a mystery of who the patients are. It's a mystery why we don't deliver better care, why we don't think about a 24/7 model around the patients. And so to me, it was so obvious, much more obvious than even video across the internet from the late 1990s. And we also, I like the very first experience I had at Evo Knowledge, where I kept wondering when the industry, like when things would kind of catch on. We were, timing's obviously a very important thing for any business, and we just knew we were in the right timing, right? Like the conversations we'd have with payers or employers, the frustration around the rising cost of healthcare, the frustration from physicians, the fact that we knew we were doing something right, the fact that we could, in a very short period of time, prove that we could deliver better outcomes. Like it just felt so obvious to us and to me that, it was never believed this would be a small solution. I always believed it needed to be. And part of it, frankly, this was a honest conversation that Clive and Paul and I had, was we sat there and we said, like if it is to be, it's up to me, right? Like we were looking around the country and saying, who else has this level of commitment and conviction and knowledge and experience of being able to demonstrate that value really can exist? And so we took it upon ourselves to say, yeah, we should be delivering, we should be the ones to do this, and we should do it at a really large scale. Thankfully, there's many others who did it along the way with us, and there's changes that are always happening in the healthcare system. There's lots of changes that are happening today in the healthcare system. Some of those are pretty damn challenging to the value-based care providers. And now, with that said, I'll contend that there's always going to be room for someone who delivers higher quality, lower cost care in any environment. And it's just a matter of time before those organizations are rewarded the way ultimately they should be, in the same way that many other organizations in the healthcare ecosystem are rewarded for, frankly, not delivering a lot of value.
And when you think back to the journey that you had, what were the key inflection points or key milestones throughout the journey, as you kind of think back to the entirety of the experience?
Yeah, and Joe, you're going to forgive me because I had to have a hard stop here in a minute, but for us, there's so many inflection points. I mean, I think the first one was just proving that we could deliver higher quality, lower total cost out of the gate, right? That was in the Houston market, and it was really a function of, can we go from one market to two, and can we go into a very different environment, different market, a market that we don't know so well, where you're building new payer relationships, you're working with the healthcare community in a market that maybe hasn't always been that friendly to value-based care or managed care. And can you really engage the hearts and minds of physicians at large organizations and small organizations? And for us, once we saw that, and we saw it really happen in a big way, and then we started looking at, okay, well, we know we can scale from one market to two. Now the next question is, what's the right amount of growth beyond that? And ultimately for us, I think as we started to lift our heads up and start having some more conversations around other parts of the country, it just became so obvious to us that that next inflection point was really scaling on a multiple market basis, and being able to prove that A, you can recruit physicians, B, you can get the right payer contracts, and C, you can engage the physicians and patients in a way to deliver better value. And that ultimately for us, going back to that notion of growth and ultimately margin, like those were the biggest things.
Amazing. Well, Tim, I know you have to run, but really grateful for you making time to speak with us today. Just such an incredible journey that you went on, and you're also incredibly kind, which is such a rare mix. And grateful for you being willing to allocate some of your time to us today.
Of course, anytime, Joe. Good to see you. We'll see you soon, hopefully.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.